The first thing she ever carved into stone was a warning nobody read. Sable had been in the Ironmere Pack for 7 months before anyone noticed the marks on the eastern corridor wall. 7 months of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that gets carved into you by people who decide your voice isn't worth hearing. She hadn't spoken a word since the night they took everything from her. Not because she couldn't, because she'd learned the hard way that words spoken aloud in Ironmere had a way of being used against you, so she used her hands instead. Her right hand was useless, 3 fingers broken and reset wrong during her first week, and Beta Draven decided she'd looked at him with too much defiance in her eyes. She'd learned to write with her left, pressing her fingertips against the cold stone until they bled, letting the blood do what her voice refused to. The first message had been simple. 8 words scratched in desperate lines above the water cistern in the east corridor. The well water in the eastern wing carries sickness. She'd seen it herself, the green film gathering along the stone lip, the way the kitchen omegas who drew from that cistern were always pale, always tired, always nursing headaches they assumed were just the weight of their lives. Sable knew the difference. She'd grown up knowing the difference. That knowledge lived in her the way breathing did. Involuntary, bone deep, hers even when everything else had been stripped away. They washed the warning off before the morning meal. She wrote it again the next week. And the week after that. By the 3rd month she had developed a rhythm. Every few days a new message. Locations of structural weakness in the south granary wall. A herd of infected deer grazing too close to the pack's hunting grounds. She'd seen them from her small window. The way they moved wrong, too slow, listing to one's side. A name. A merchant who came to trade twice a season and whose wagon, she had noticed, carried hidden compartments beneath the grain sacks. She didn't know what was in them. She knew they smelled like iron and fear. No one acted on any of it. Beta Draven found her writing once, caught her mid-word in the lower corridor near the supply rooms, and he'd grabbed her left wrist and twisted until she felt something pop. She'd bit down on the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper and hadn't made a sound. She never made a sound. That was the one thing she still controlled. He'd had the wall scrubbed down in front of her, watching her face the whole time, waiting for her to break. She'd watched the words disappear and felt nothing on the outside. On the inside, she was already composing the next one. She didn't let herself think too hard about why she kept doing it. Survival instinct, maybe, something older, a stubborn, half-buried belief that the information she carried mattered, that it was meant to reach someone, even if that someone hadn't appeared yet. She'd been told her whole life that she saw things others missed. She'd believed it once, but she just acted on it, quietly, because acting on it was the only thing that felt like being herself anymore. The 43rd message was different. She'd been awake since the early hours of the morning, pressed against her small window watching the tree line when she saw the scouts. Not Ironmere scouts. Their movements were different, bolder. They didn't bother being careful because they owned these lands. These were outsiders moving in precise, disciplined formation, and the insignia on their dark cloaks caught the pre-dawn light just enough for her to recognize it. The king's men, but Sable felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, because she'd burned through most of her hope by month 3. More like recognition. A door she'd forgotten about, somewhere deep in her chest, creaking open just slightly. She pressed her fingers to the stone and wrote. This time she didn't write a warning, but she wrote a name. Her name, her real name. The one that had been taken from her along with everything else, buried under the false identity Draven had constructed when he'd dragged her here 7 months ago from the ruins of her mother's house. She wove it into the message the way her mother had once taught her to weave patterns into thread, hidden in the first letter of each line, invisible unless you knew to look for it. But she didn't know if the king's man would know to look, but she wrote it anyway. Kael Ashvane had not planned to stop at Ironmere. His route had taken him through the Northern Territories on a scouting errand that was, officially, about border security and trade route verification. Unofficially, it was about the reports his spy master Petra had been quietly compiling for the past 4 months. Fragmentary, strange, the kind of intelligence that didn't fit neatly into any existing category. Someone inside Ironmere Pack was leaving messages in the corridor walls. Blood messages, which was unusual enough to notice. But the content of them, that was what had made Petra bring it to him personally, setting a folder of transcriptions on his desk at 2 in the morning with an expression he didn't often see on her face. "Someone in there knows things they shouldn't know," she'd said. "Things they absolutely should know and somehow do." Petra had sharp eyes and a sharper mind, and she'd visited Ironmere twice in her own capacity, as a trade liaison, careful and unremarked. She'd photographed what she could of the corridor walls on her first visit before the messages were scrubbed. On her second, she'd found new ones, different content, same blood, same left-handed scrape to the letters. She'd noted the slight irregularity of the strokes, the way certain letters pulled up, and right the way they did when someone was compensating for injury or dominant hand damage. Whoever was writing them was hurt and writing anyway. Kael had read the transcriptions 3 times before he'd rerouted his patrol north. He walked the eastern corridor himself on the morning of his arrival, while Ironmere's Alpha, a broad-shouldered man named Voss, who smiled with all his teeth and none of his eyes, made a show of welcoming the king's presence. Kael smiled back and let his gaze move over everything Voss wasn't showing him. He found the newest message an hour later, in the lower corridor near the supply rooms. He read it twice, and on the second reading his breath stopped. The warning itself was about the merchant, the same one Petra had flagged in her notes, the one with the grain wagon and the hidden compartments. But Kael's eyes were moving differently now, tracking down the left margin, reading only the first letter of each line, Serafine. He stood very still. Seraphine, that was a name he knew. A name that was supposed to be connected to a burnt house and a closed investigation and a Pack records entry that said deceased in clean, final ink. A name his mother's old correspondence had mentioned years ago. In a context he hadn't understood until much later. He looked at the handwriting again. The left-hand compensation, the way the pressure on the letters was uneven, heavier at the start of each stroke, lighter at the end, the way someone wrote when something hurt. He kept his face neutral and went to find Alpha Voss, brought her to stand before him in the great hall. Sable had known they would. But she'd written the message and then gone back to her room and sat on the edge of her cot and waited, her hands folded in her lap, her heart doing something complicated in her chest that she refused to call fear. She'd made her move. Whatever came next came next. She hadn't expected him to be young, or maybe not young, but present, in a way that Alpha Voss never was. Voss always seemed to be somewhere else behind his eyes, calculating, performing. The man standing at the center of Ironmere's great hall was simply there, watching her cross the room, with the kind of attention that didn't feel like assessment. It felt like recognition. She stopped 3 feet from him, but she didn't bow. She'd stopped bowing to people who hadn't earned it somewhere around month 2. He looked at her hands. She saw his gaze go first to her right. The crooked set of the fingers, the way she held it slightly away from her body, out of old habit. Then to her left, where the newest cuts were still raw across the pads of her fingers. He looked back at her face. "Seraphine," he said, quietly, not a question. She felt the word hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Her real name, in a stranger's mouth, spoken without cruelty or ownership or mockery. Just acknowledgement, like he was handing her something she'd lost. She lifted her chin and held his gaze and gave him the smallest, most deliberate nod she'd made in 7 months. The hall was full of people. Voss stood to the side with his beta and 3 of his senior wolves, and Sable could feel the calculation radiating off him. The rapid assessment of how much Kael knew, how much he could know, whether there was still a play to be made here. She'd watched Voss think for 7 months. She knew exactly what he looked like when he was running out of options. "She's a pack ward," Voss said, smoothly, taken in after her pack dissolved. "She has no status to—" "I wasn't speaking to you," Kael said. It was said pleasantly, the way you'd correct someone who'd interrupted a private conversation at a dinner party, but the room went silent like someone had cut a wire. Kael's attention came back to her. "I read your messages," he said. "All of them." Sable looked at him steadily, but she already knew this, in the way she'd always known things. Not through any magic or gift exactly, just through the particular kind of attention that being powerless teaches you. She'd known, the moment she finished writing that 43rd message, that it would reach someone. She'd known it the way she knew weather coming before the sky changed. But she reached into her sleeve with her left hand and pulled out the small piece of charcoal she'd lifted from the fireplace that morning, just in case. She looked around the hall for a surface. Kael, following her gaze, stepped aside and gestured toward the long council table without being asked. She crossed to it and pressed the charcoal flat against the wood and wrote 6 words. "The merchant comes back in 3 days." She looked at him, read it, a muscle moved in his jaw. "We know," he said. "He'll be here." She wrote again, faster. "He's not alone. 2 men in the wood, armed." Kael didn't look surprised exactly, but she saw something change in his expression, a sharpening, an adjustment, the way someone's focus shifts when a picture resolves into something clearer than they expected. "How do you know that?" he asked. She tapped her temple, then pointed at the window on the south wall. He glanced at the window. The tree line beyond it was dense and still in the morning light. "Saw them," he said. She nodded. "When?" She held up 4 fingers. 4 days ago." She nodded again. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him the way she watched everything, carefully, behind the part of herself she kept braced for impact. But he didn't give her anything to brace against. He just stood there, in Ironmere's great hall, in front of his men and Voss and all of it, and looked at her like she was the most reliable source of information in the room. He asked her, very carefully, "Is there anything else I should know?" Sable looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to the table and wrote for almost 5 full minutes, covering one whole side of his official survey document. She wrote about the granary wall and the infected deer and the merchant's second man who visited separately every 30 days and left with a smaller wagon and a different route. But she wrote about the names she'd overheard in fragments over 7 months of being invisible in the corridors of a pack that thought she couldn't speak and therefore couldn't matter. She wrote about Voss himself, the dates, the deals, the conversations she'd tracked in the careful ledger of her memory, because she hadn't had paper until recently and had to hold everything inside her own head, preserved perfectly, waiting for exactly this moment. She put the charcoal down and stepped back. Kael read every word. He didn't rush it. When he finished, he looked at Voss. Sable looked too. Voss's face was still arranged in something that resembled composure, but she'd watched that face for 7 months. She knew the exact moment when the performance stopped working from the inside out. It was happening right now, behind his eyes, a private collapse of a man who thought he'd been careful and is discovering he wasn't careful enough. "Better Draven," Kael said, still looking at Voss. "I'm going to need to speak with him as well." They gave her a room in the east wing that night, while Kael's men secured the pack house and began the formal investigation. A real room, not the converted storage space she'd been living in, but a proper guest room with a fire already burning, and water heated in a basin, and clean clothes folded at the foot of the bed. She stood in the middle of it for a long time before she could make herself move. A woman from Kael's retinue, his head healer, who had a brisk, kind way of moving that reminded Sable of her mother, came in and looked at her hands without asking permission, which Sable appreciated. She appreciated not being asked to explain or consent to things that were obviously necessary. The healer cleaned and wrapped her right hand with a care that made something unexpectedly tight happen in Sable's throat, and set the fingers that had been reset wrong and healed badly, and gave her something for the pain that tasted like pine resin and worked faster than Sable expected. "The left hand will heal fine on its own," the healer said, not looking up from her work. "These cuts are superficial, have good instincts about pressure and depth." Sable looked at her own hands and thought about 7 months of learning exactly how much pressure to use. She didn't write that down. Some things didn't need an audience. She ate the food they brought, actually ate it. Not the performance of eating she'd gotten used to, picking at meals in Ironmere's kitchen with one eye always on the door. But she sat by the fire and felt warmth for the first time in what felt like years, and let herself be still. Kael came to speak with her after the evening's business was done. He knocked, which she hadn't expected. She opened the door and he was standing there alone, without his retinue. And he had the slightly tired look of someone who'd been doing difficult things efficiently for many hours. "Can I come in?" he asked, but she stepped back and gestured to the chair across from hers by the fire. He sat, but she sat. For a moment neither of them did anything, and she noticed that he seemed comfortable with silence. Not uncomfortable, comfortable, the way people sometimes are when they're just waiting to talk again, but genuinely at ease in it, like he'd spent time in it himself. He said, "I need to tell you some things. And I want to get them right, so I'm going to take a moment to figure out how to say them." She looked at him and waited. He said, "Your mother's house didn't burn down in an accident. We've known that for about 2 months. We didn't know where you were, because the record Voss filed said you were dead, and we had no reason to question it until Petra started pulling together the corridor reports." He paused. "I'm sorry it took this long." She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, slow and even, but she'd known about her mother's house, had known the moment she smelled the smoke from 40 miles away and felt the particular silence where her mother's presence used to be, the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue, over and over, disbelieving. She'd known it wasn't an accident. She just hadn't known if anyone else would. Picked up the charcoal from where she'd set it on the small side table and wrote on the back of a letter that had been left in the room, someone's old correspondence, already written on one side. "What happens now?" He looked at the words. "To Voss, formal charges, trial under King's law. To you." He stopped. "That depends on what you want. You have rights that were illegally suspended. Your status, your name, your mother's lands. All of that is recoverable under the law. You don't have to make any decisions tonight," she wrote. "I'm not going back to being silent." He met her eyes. "You were never silent," he said. "You were the loudest person in this building for 7 months. You just needed someone who knew how to listen." Something moved in her chest. That door again, not just cracked open now, but swinging wide, letting in light and cold air and the terrifying possibility of something other than endurance. She wrote one more word on the paper. "Stay." He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. She held his gaze and didn't take it back. "Okay," he said. 3 days later, the merchant came. He came with his grain wagon and his hidden compartments and his 2 men in the tree line, and Kael's people were waiting in exactly the places Sable had mapped out on the council table with charcoal, and a patience that came from 7 months of watching without being watched back. It went quickly and cleanly, the way things go when someone has done the intelligence work properly and the other side has no idea how thoroughly they've been seen. Sable watched from the eastern window. The same window she'd watched from for months. The one where she'd seen the infected deer and the merchant's route and the king's scouts in the pre-dawn dark and known, somehow, that the 43rd message was the one that would finally reach someone. Heard Kael's voice in the courtyard below, giving orders in the same quiet, present way he did everything, and felt her wolf, who had been silent as long as she had, curled up small and waiting in the space behind her ribs, lift her head. They sealed their bond on the last night before his men were due to return south. Not in the great hall, not with ceremony or witnesses, or any of the formal weight that would come later when things were settled and her name was restored in the official record. Just in the quiet of the East Wing room with the fire burning down low, and his hands careful around hers, and the particular stillness of two people who have both spent a long time being alone and are choosing, deliberately and with eyes fully open, not to be anymore. She didn't speak, not yet. It had come in its own time, when her voice was ready to be used again on her own terms, when it didn't carry 7 months of someone else's cruelty in it. But when he pressed his forehead to hers in the old way, the pack way, the way that means, I see you and I'm staying, she made a sound. Small and quiet and entirely her own. It was enough.